In the early morning hours of March 3, 2026, something extraordinary happened over the skies of Iran. An aircraft that first flew during the presidency of Harry Truman, an aircraft that was designed to carry nuclear bombs across the Soviet Union during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, dropped precision-guided munitions on Iranian ballistic missile sites and command and control facilities in one of the most intense air campaigns the United States had conducted in a generation. The aircraft was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, and it was doing what it has always done, delivering massive, overwhelming firepower anywhere on the planet, on demand, with devastating accuracy. This is the complete story of the B-52. From the drawing boards of Boeing in the late 1940s, through the frozen tension of the Cold War, the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, and now the skies over Iran. This is the story of the greatest bomber ever built, a machine that entered service in the age of propeller-driven warplanes and is still flying combat missions more than 70 years later. An aircraft so well designed, so adaptable, and so deeply embedded in American military power that it may become the first military aircraft in history to remain in active service for 100 years. This is the story of the B-52 Stratofortress. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated air campaign targeting Iran's military infrastructure, ballistic missile program, and command and control network. The strikes began with stealth aircraft, F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning fighters, and B-2 Spirit stealth bombers cutting through Iranian air defenses in the opening hours. Within 48 hours, United States Central Command confirmed that more than 200 targets had already been struck across Iran. Then, the heavy bombers arrived. On March 3, 2026, United States Central Command officially confirmed that B-52 Stratofortress bombers had entered the fight. The B-52s were operating out of RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, England, and the Diego Garcia military base in the Indian Ocean, both of which had been made available to American forces following a reversal of an earlier British decision to restrict their use for strikes on Iran. The targets were specific and strategic: Iranian ballistic missile sites, missile production and storage facilities, command and control nodes that allowed Iran's missile brigades to coordinate launch sequences and conduct large-scale attacks. Analysts noted that by striking these command networks, American forces were attempting to blind Iran's ability to coordinate missile salvos rather than simply destroying individual launchers. What made the B-52's role particularly significant was the way the aircraft was employed. Rather than flying directly over Iranian territory and exposing itself to whatever remained of Iran's air defense network, the B-52 stood off at a distance, in some cases more than 1,000 kilometers from its targets, and launched AGM-158, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, commonly known as JSM missiles, and their extended range variant, the JSM-ER. These are stealthy, low-flying cruise missiles with an armor-piercing warhead, weighing approximately 1,000 pounds. They fly nap-of-the-earth profiles, hugging the terrain and evading radar, before striking hardened targets with precision. Each B-52 can carry up to 20 of these missiles at a time. A single aircraft operating from hundreds of miles away, safe from virtually any ground-based threat, could unleash a barrage of 20 precision-guided cruise missiles in a single pass. Multiple B-52s operating in a coordinated strike package could saturate entire military complexes, destroying every building, runway, taxiway, and launcher in a single coordinated bombardment. Defense analyst Francis Toxusa described the arrival of the B-52s as a transformation of the entire campaign. He noted that a single B-52 carries a payload more than 4 times the capacity of an F-15 Strike Eagle. The aircraft does not need to be stealthy when it is launching weapons from 1,000 kilometers away. Its weapons are stealthy. The B-52 itself is simply the delivery vehicle. By the time Operation Epic Fury had reached its first 100 hours, American and Israeli forces had struck more than 2,000 targets across Iran, All three of America's strategic bomber types, the B-2 Spirit, the B-1B Lancer, and the B-52 Stratofortress, were flying combat missions simultaneously over Iranian territory. United States Central Command Admiral Brad Cooper described the strikes as nearly double the scale of the air campaign against Iraq in 2003, which had itself been one of the most intense in American military history. And there, in the middle of it all, was the B-52, an aircraft born in the Eisenhower era, an aircraft that flew its first test flight in April 1952, still delivering bombs, still reshaping the battlefield, still the backbone of American air power. To understand why that is remarkable, you need to go back to the beginning. The story of the B-52 begins in 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II. The United States Army Air Forces, which would soon become the independent United States Air Force, were already thinking about the next war. And in the early days of the nuclear age, the next war was likely to be fought with atomic weapons. The Air Force issued a requirement for a new long-range strategic bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory without the need for forward bases in Europe or Asia. The aircraft needed enormous range. It needed to fly at high altitude, above the reach of Soviet anti-aircraft guns. And it needed to carry a very large payload. The Boeing Aircraft Company began working on designs in 1946. Their early concepts were conventional enough, featuring swept wings and propeller-driven turboprop engines, the most powerful available at the time. The design was designated the Model 462. Boeing engineers worked on it for 2 years, refining the concept, calculating ranges, estimating payload capacities. Then, in October 1948, everything changed. Boeing representatives flew to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to present their latest design to Air Force officials. The meeting did not go well. The Air Force was deeply dissatisfied with the turboprop concept. They wanted something faster, something that could reach Soviet territory quickly, before defenses could be organized. They wanted a jet-powered bomber. According to one of the most famous stories in aviation history, the Boeing team did not return home dejected. Instead, they checked into a local hotel and spent a single weekend completely redesigning their aircraft from scratch. Working around the clock, Boeing engineers George Scherer, Art Carlson, von Blumenthal, Maynard Pinnell, and Ed Wells reimagined the entire aircraft concept. They drew a new swept-wing design, powered by 8 Pratt & Whitney turbojet engines, arranged in pairs under the wings. By Monday morning, they had a 33-page proposal, a scale model carved from balsa wood, and a completely new aircraft on paper. It was one of the greatest engineering sprints in aviation history. The Air Force was impressed. Development was approved, and Boeing designated the new aircraft the XB-52. The prototype made its maiden flight on April 15, 1952, with test pilot Alvin Tex Johnston at the controls. The aircraft performed beyond expectations. It was fast, it was stable, it could carry enormous loads, and it had a range that put virtually any target in the Soviet Union within its reach. The production version that entered service was designated the B-52A, followed quickly by the B-52B. But Boeing and the Air Force were already iterating rapidly, and the most important early variant was the B-52D, which entered service in 1956 and became the first truly combat-capable version of the aircraft. The B-52 was built around a straightforward philosophy. You do not need to be clever if you are powerful enough. The aircraft's 185-foot wingspan was, at the time it was designed, one of the largest of any military aircraft in the world. Its 8 engines could generate enough thrust to push the aircraft to speeds approaching 650 miles per hour at high altitude. And its internal bomb bay could carry nuclear weapons of almost any size in the American arsenal. The aircraft that emerged from Boeing's Wichita, Kansas factory was enormous, angular, and utterly utilitarian. It was not beautiful. It was not graceful. Pilots who flew it gave it a nickname that stuck immediately: the Buff, Big Ugly Fat Fellow, and the polite version. Other versions of that acronym existed, and were used more frequently by the crews who flew it. But everyone who flew the B-52 understood immediately that it was something exceptional. It was a weapon of almost incomprehensible power. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the B-52 was the centerpiece of American nuclear deterrence. The Strategic Air Command, commanded by the legendary and deeply intimidating General Curtis LeMay, operated hundreds of B-52s on constant alert, ready to deliver nuclear weapons to Soviet targets within minutes of an order being received. At the height of the Cold War, Strategic Air Command kept a significant portion of its B-52 fleet airborne at all times. Bombers flew continuous airborne alert missions, staying aloft for days at a time with the help of aerial refueling, always positioned to strike if the call came. This program, known as Operation Chrome Dome, was one of the most demanding and dangerous continuous military operations in American history. The standard operating procedure was harrowing by any measure. A B-52 crew would take off from their base, fly to a predetermined orbit point near Soviet territory, circle for hours, refuel from a KC-135 tanker aircraft, and continue circling. At all times, the aircraft carried nuclear weapons. At all times, the crew was ready to receive the authentication codes that would direct them to their targets. The men who flew these missions understood that if they ever received those codes, it meant civilization as they knew it had already ended. There were accidents. In January 1966, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a KC-135 tanker during a refueling operation over the coast of Spain near the town of Palomares. The B-52 broke apart. 3 of the 4 nuclear weapons were recovered relatively quickly, but the 4th fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was not recovered for 80 days. In January 1968, another B-52 carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The nuclear weapons were destroyed in the resulting fire, and radioactive material was scattered across the ice. These incidents, and others like them, ultimately led to the discontinuation of the Airborne Alert Program, but they also demonstrated something important about the B-52. Even in disaster, the aircraft's nuclear weapons did not detonate. The safety systems worked. The weapons were designed to require specific deliberate actions before they would arm, and those actions never happened in an uncontrolled accident. Through this period, Boeing and the Air Force continued developing new variants of the B-52. The B-52E improved the navigation and bombing systems. The B-52F improved range and fuel capacity. The B-52G introduced a shorter vertical tail, a new wing design, and an integral fuel tank system that dramatically increased range. But the most important variant of all was the last one to be built. The B-52H, which entered production in 1960 and deliveries completed by 1962, replaced the original water-injected turbojet engines with Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines. The new engines were dramatically more fuel-efficient, increasing range by approximately 40%. They were also quieter and more reliable. And unlike the earlier variants, the B-52H was also equipped with an internal gun, a 20mm Gatling cannon mounted in the tail for self-defense against intercepting fighters. All 744 B-52s built across the various production variants were eventually retired or destroyed, with one crucial exception, the B-52H. Every B-52 flying today is a B-52H, and the youngest of them rolled off the assembly line in 1962, making the entire current fleet of approximately 76 aircraft at least 63 years old. The B-52's first true combat came not in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, but in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the experience of Vietnam would reshape both the aircraft and the doctrine that surrounded it. American involvement in Vietnam escalated rapidly through the early 1960s. By 1965, American ground forces were engaged in large-scale combat operations, and the military was searching for ways to apply maximum firepower against an enemy that used the jungle for concealment and avoided open engagements whenever possible. The solution was carpet bombing. And for carpet bombing, nothing compared to the B-52. The first B-52 strike mission in Vietnam took place on June 18, 1965, when 27 B-52F bombers flew from Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam and dropped conventional bombs on a suspected Viet Cong concentration in Binh Duong Province, south of Saigon. The operation was called Arc Light, and it established the template for hundreds of similar missions that followed. A typical Arc Light mission involves cells of 3 B-52s flying in tight formation at high altitude, far above the reach of the anti-aircraft weapons that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese possessed in most areas. Each aircraft carried up to 108 conventional bombs of 500 pounds each, for a total payload per cell of over 300 bombs. When a 3-ship cell released its entire load simultaneously, the bombs fell across a rectangular area approximately 1 mile wide and 2 miles long. Nothing within that rectangle survived. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. B-52s flew so high that they were invisible and inaudible from the ground. The first indication of a strike was the ground suddenly erupting in a line of massive explosions that marched steadily across the landscape. Survivors described the experience as indescribable terror. North Vietnamese commanders noted that arc light strikes were among the most feared weapons in the American arsenal, not because of their precision, but because of their sheer, overwhelming destructive power. Through the late 1960s, B-52s flew thousands of missions over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The missions expanded from jungle strikes against troop concentrations to interdiction missions targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route, trying to cut the flow of weapons and supplies from North Vietnam to Viet Cong forces in the south. But the most dramatic chapter of the B-52's Vietnam service came in December 1972. After years of difficult negotiations in Paris aimed at ending the war, the peace talks had collapsed. North Vietnam had walked away from the table, and President Richard Nixon decided on a dramatic escalation designed to force Hanoi back to negotiations on American terms. He authorized Operation Linebacker II, also known as the Christmas bombings, an 11-day campaign of intensive B-52 strikes against Hanoi itself and the major port city of Haiphong. The operation began on the night of December 18, 1972, and it was immediately clear that this was something different from arc light. The B-52s were not bombing jungle. They were bombing one of the most heavily defended cities in Asia. North Vietnam had spent years building one of the most sophisticated anti-aircraft and surface-to-air missile networks in the world around Hanoi, supplied and operated with significant Soviet assistance. On the first night of Linebacker II, 129 B-52s flew against Hanoi. North Vietnamese defenses fired 200 surface-to-air missiles. 3 B-52s were shot down. Over the next 10 days, the strikes continued night after night. In total, 15 B-52s were lost to enemy action during Linebacker II, and several more were badly damaged. The losses were painful. B-52 crews flew into what amounted to the most intense anti-aircraft environment in the history of aerial warfare, and they did not flinch. They flew their missions. They dropped their bombs. And the bombs fell on Hanoi with a consistency and overwhelming weight of firepower that nothing could withstand. By December 28, North Vietnam had signaled its willingness to return to negotiations. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. Whether Linebacker II was the decisive factor in forcing that agreement remains debated by historians, but what is not debated is the sheer destructive power that the B-52 brought to bear against one of the most heavily defended targets in the world, and continued to bring to bear, even while taking losses. The lessons of Vietnam were absorbed and applied. The B-52 was modified and upgraded. New electronic countermeasures were added to confuse radar-guided missiles. Tactics were changed to reduce the predictability that had made some of the early Linebacker II missions more vulnerable than they needed to be. The aircraft was made more survivable, more flexible, and more capable. But Vietnam had also proven something that would define the B-52's identity for the rest of its service life. This was not just a nuclear delivery vehicle. This was a precision conventional strike platform capable of operating in high-threat environments and delivering devastating firepower against any target that needed to be destroyed. The years after Vietnam were years of quiet but profound transformation for the B-52. The Cold War continued, and the nuclear deterrence mission remained. But the Air Force was also thinking carefully about how to use the aircraft in conventional conflicts against adversaries who were not the Soviet Union. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the B-52 received a series of important upgrades. New navigation systems were installed. The aircraft's ability to fly at low altitude, evading radar by staying below detection horizons, was improved. New conventional weapons were integrated, including the AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile, a long-range subsonic cruise missile that could be launched from the B-52 while the aircraft was still hundreds of miles from its target. Then came August 2, 1990, when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his army to invade and occupy the small nation of Kuwait. The United States and a coalition of allied nations responded with a massive military buildup in Saudi Arabia, and on January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. The B-52 was in it from the first night. 7 B-52Gs flew from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, traveled to the Persian Gulf region, launched their cruise missiles at Iraqi targets, and returned home. The round trip lasted 35 hours and covered approximately 14,000 miles. It was, at the time, the longest combat mission in aviation history. Over the 43 days of Desert Storm, B-52s flew 624 sorties and dropped approximately 30% of all the bombs used by coalition forces in the entire campaign. They struck Iraqi airfields, supply depots, Republican Guard troop concentrations, and the massive army of Iraqi forces dug into defensive positions in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The impact was enormous. Iraqi soldiers who surrendered described the B-52 strikes as the most terrifying experience of the war. Iraqi units that had held their positions against ground attack and artillery fire sometimes collapsed entirely after a B-52 strike, their will to fight simply destroyed by the sheer, overwhelming violence of the bombardment. Desert Storm also introduced the B-52 to a new era of precision weapons. Alongside its traditional gravity bombs, the B-52 now carried the AGM-86C conventional air-launched cruise missile, a variant of the nuclear-tipped missile that had been modified to carry a conventional warhead. These weapons could be launched from hundreds of miles away and guided to their targets with accuracy measured in feet rather than yards. The Gulf War marked the transition of the B-52 from a Cold War nuclear deterrent into a flexible precision conventional strike platform. It was a transformation that would continue and accelerate through the following decades. After Desert Storm, the United States found itself repeatedly called upon to use military force in situations that fell short of full-scale war. The B-52 was part of almost all of them. In 1995 and again in 1998, B-52s flew missions over Bosnia and the broader Balkans region as part of NATO operations to end the ethnic cleansing and military campaigns that had torn the former Yugoslavia apart. The missions were similar to those flown in Desert Storm, using precision-guided and standoff weapons to strike military targets while minimizing civilian casualties. In December 1998, Operation Desert Fox targeted Iraqi military installations and the infrastructure supporting Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs. B-52s flew cruise missile strikes against Iraqi targets in a 4-day campaign that demonstrated once again the aircraft's ability to project power from extremely long range without placing crews in significant danger. And in March 1999, B-52s participated in Operation Allied Force, the NATO air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia over the conflict in Kosovo. The aircraft flew from RAF Fairford in England, the same base from which they would operate more than 25 years later during the Iran campaign, and struck Yugoslav military targets with both cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs. Through all of these operations, the B-52 was being continuously modernized, the aircraft's avionics were updated, new weapons systems were integrated. The ability to communicate and coordinate with other aircraft, with ground forces, and with commanders in distant headquarters was dramatically improved. By the end of the 1990s, the B-52 looked nothing like it had in 1962 from the inside, even as the basic airframe remained fundamentally unchanged. The September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States launched the longest sustained combat deployment in the B-52's history. Within weeks, American forces were conducting operations in Afghanistan against the Taliban regime and the al-Qaeda organization it had harbored. And the B-52 was there from the beginning. In Afghanistan, the B-52 took on a role that no one had fully anticipated. The enemy was not lined up in defensive positions like the Iraqi army in Desert Storm. The Taliban and al-Qaeda were dispersed across mountainous terrain, operating in small groups, moving constantly. Hunting them required a different approach. The B-52 became a loitering strike platform. Rather than flying in, dropping a planned load of bombs and returning to base, B-52s would fly long orbits over Afghanistan, sometimes for hours at a time, working with Special Forces operators on the ground who were directing fire against enemy positions. When a target was identified, the Special Forces operator would radio coordinates to the B-52 crew, who would program them into a precision-guided bomb and release it within minutes. This was a completely new use for the aircraft. It was essentially functioning as an extremely well-armed, extremely long-endurance close air support platform, providing fire support to troops in contact with the enemy in near real time. It was not what the B-52 had been designed to do, but it turned out to be something the aircraft could do remarkably well. B-52s flew extensively in support of Operation Anaconda in March 2002, one of the largest conventional military operations of the early Afghan campaign, and continued flying missions over Afghanistan throughout the following decade. In Iraq, beginning with the invasion in March 2003, B-52s again played a central role. They struck Republican Guard formations ahead of the advancing ground troops. They attacked command and control facilities in Baghdad and other cities. They served as on-call fire support for ground forces encountering resistance. Through the long years of the Iraq insurgency that followed the initial invasion, B-52s continued to provide support, though the nature of the conflict shifted towards smaller engagements, where the aircraft's massive payload was sometimes more than was needed, but they remained available, ready to deliver overwhelming force when circumstances required it. Throughout its combat service, the B-52 has undergone continuous modernization. Understanding what the aircraft looks like today compared to what it looked like when it rolled off the assembly line in the early 1960s requires appreciating just how comprehensively it has been rebuilt from the inside out. The most important recent modernization program is the Commercial Engine Replacement Program known as CERP. The B-52H's existing Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engines, which date back to the 1960s, are being replaced with Rolls-Royce F-130 engines. The new engines are dramatically more fuel-efficient, increasing range and reducing the number of aerial refueling operations required on a typical mission. They are also significantly more reliable and far easier to maintain, reducing the burden on maintenance crews and increasing the aircraft's availability for operations. The cockpit has been completely rebuilt. The original B-52 cockpits were filled with analog gauges, dials, and instruments that would have been familiar to pilots of the 1950s. Today's B-52 cockpits feature modern digital displays, GPS navigation systems, and data links that allow the aircraft to communicate seamlessly with satellites, other aircraft, and ground command centers in real time. The weapons systems have been fundamentally transformed. The B-52 can now carry virtually every conventional weapon in the American inventory, from traditional iron bombs to the most advanced precision-guided munitions available. These include the JDAM, a guidance kit that attaches to standard bombs and converts them into GPS-guided precision weapons accurate to within a few meters. They include the JASM and JASMER cruise missiles that have been so central to the Iran campaign, and they include the long-range anti-ship missile known as LRAM, giving the B-52 a significant anti-naval capability that is increasingly relevant in the Indo-Pacific theater. The Air Force is also integrating hypersonic weapons onto the B-52. The AGM-183, Air-Launched Rapid Response Weapon, or ARRW, is a hypersonic glide vehicle that travels at speeds exceeding Mach 5, making it essentially impossible to intercept with current missile defense systems. The B-52's large internal bay and external hardpoints make it one of the few aircraft capable of carrying these enormous weapons. In future high-end conflicts against peer adversaries like China or Russia, the ability to launch hypersonic weapons from standoff range could be decisive. The aircraft has also received substantial improvements to its electronic warfare capabilities. Modern electronic warfare systems can jam enemy radar, disrupt communications, and confuse surface-to-air missile guidance systems. These improvements mean that even against adversaries with sophisticated integrated air defense systems, the B-52 can conduct standoff missions with a significantly reduced risk of interception. As of 2026, the United States Air Force operates 76 B-52H bombers, assigned primarily to 2 bomb wings, the 2nd Bomb Wing at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and the 5th Bomb Wing at Mena Air Force Base in North Dakota. A small number are assigned to the Air Force Reserve and the Air National Guard. The aircraft perform multiple missions simultaneously. They are part of the nuclear triad, still capable of delivering nuclear gravity bombs and air-launched cruise missiles if called upon. They are conventional strike platforms, as demonstrated most recently in Iran. They serve as test beds for new weapons technologies, and they perform a crucial deterrence mission simply by existing, by being visible, by flying training missions and deployments that remind potential adversaries of the reach and power of American air power. The Air Force has committed to flying the B-52 until at least 2050. With the new Rolls-Royce engines, the aircraft's service life could extend even further. Some officials have spoken openly about the possibility of the B-52 remaining in service until 2060 or beyond. That would make it an aircraft still in active military service 108 years after its first flight. No other military aircraft in history has come close to that kind of longevity. The B-21 Raider, the Air Force's new stealth bomber, is currently entering service and will eventually become the backbone of American strategic air power. But the B-21 is expensive, and the Air Force plans to build only a limited number of them. The B-52, with its massive payload, its unmatched range, and its now thoroughly modern weapon systems, will continue to serve alongside the B-21 for decades, performing the missions where stealth is not the primary requirement and where payload and persistence are what matter most. In a future conflict with China over Taiwan, for example, B-52s would likely stand off at long range in the Philippine Sea or the Western Pacific, launching salvo after salvo of JASMER cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons against Chinese naval vessels, air defense systems, and military infrastructure. They would not need to penetrate Chinese airspace. They would not need to expose themselves to Chinese surface-to-air missiles or fighter aircraft. They would simply need to be where they could launch their weapons, and with a range of nearly 9,000 miles without refueling, and essentially unlimited range with aerial refueling, they could be anywhere. What does it mean that an aircraft designed in 1948 and built between 1952 and 1962 is still flying combat missions in 2026? What does it say about the vision of the engineers who created it, the adaptability of the American military institutions that operated it, and the fundamental rightness of the design philosophy that underpinned it? It says several things. It says that some engineering decisions are so sound, so fundamentally correct, that they outlast the era in which they were made. The B-52's enormous wing, Its generous internal volume, its straightforward structural design, its ability to carry almost anything that can be built and attached to an aircraft, these were not accidental. They were the result of engineers thinking carefully about what an aircraft needed to be in order to serve well for a long time. They could not have known exactly how long, but they built for longevity. It says that adaptability is more valuable than any single capability. The B-52 was built to deliver nuclear weapons at high altitude over the Soviet Union. It ended up doing carpet bombing over Vietnam, close air support over Afghanistan, cruise missile strikes against Iraq, and precision-guided standoff strikes against Iran. None of those missions existed in their current form when the aircraft was designed. But the aircraft was able to do all of them, because it was big enough, powerful enough, and structurally sound enough to accept the upgrades that each new mission required. And it says something about the nature of strategic air power itself. Air power, at its most fundamental level, is about the ability to bring force to bear anywhere on the planet, quickly and with overwhelming effect. The B-52 is the purest expression of that concept ever built. It can reach anywhere, it can carry anything, and it can deliver its weapons with precision that was unimaginable when it was designed. In March 2026, over the skies of Iran, an aircraft that first flew during the Korean War demonstrated that it is still the most capable long-range strike platform in the world for the missions it is asked to fly. Its crews are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in a professional sense, of the men who flew it over Hanoi in December 1972. Its targets are different. Its weapons are different. Its navigation systems, its communication systems, its electronic warfare systems, all different. But the aircraft itself, the great swept wings, the pods of engines hanging beneath them, the enormous fuselage that can swallow a payload larger than most aircraft can lift off the ground, that is unchanged. And that is the point. The B-52 Stratofortress is not simply an aircraft, it is a statement. A statement that American military power is real, that it is global in reach, that it is patient and persistent, and that it will still be there, still delivering consequences, long after anything that challenged it has been forgotten. The buff is not going anywhere. This has been the complete history of the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress.